Hey, good morning. Today is the 8th of November, 2024. This is Wes Fryer. I am in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I'd like to talk about elections and God's will. This is part of a series I call Wisdom with Wes that I started earlier this year. And I am a classroom teacher, middle school teacher, teaching media literacy and STEM here in Charlotte, North Carolina. And this is a nonpartisan message. We have had a very momentous election in the United States this week on Tuesday. I have my flag today. I have my gold retriever tie. I have my Air Force Academy lanyard for my school badge. Won't show my belt. I've got my Power Cat belt on for K-State. All these different things we signal. And for the purposes of this video, I'm not interested in sharing how I voted. What I want to talk about is the ways in which some people at some times invoke God's will and purport to know what God's will is and what it is not. And so what I would like to do first, actually, is read you an excerpt from the second inaugural speech given by President Abraham Lincoln. And I'm using a new app called Teleprompter Lite. So we'll see how this goes. This speech was shared on March 4th, 1865. This was 41 days before President Lincoln would be assassinated and killed by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. And I think that his words here are prescient, are relevant to our current political moment for multiple reasons. But one of the most important is that he talks about how in the time of the Civil War, both sides claimed God and both sides purported to, have God on their side. Okay. The U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 1865. And I'll include a link in the description for this video to where you can go to this entire inaugural on the National Park Service. And so here's what Lincoln said. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. End quote. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. And that's the end of that quotation. So here's what I want to share, because in the midst of this very contentious and tumultuous election, there are some really big feelings, and people are processing what happened and what it means, not just for today, but for the next 4 years and for even longer. I was listening to a podcast today that was now comparing President Trump to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in terms of length of impact, right? Because FDR was our president for 12 years, and had he not died in office, he would have served for 16. And, he ushered in a very seismic change politically in the United States, and it could be argued in the world. As I record this on Friday, the election results have been announced. They're still coming in, and we still don't know the results of certain House races. But, President Trump has won in a landslide victory. He has not only won the Electoral College, but he has won the popular vote here in the United States. And so whether you voted for him or against him, for Kamala Harris or against Kamala Harris, however you voted, whether you identify as an independent, a Republican, a Democrat, people in the United States are surprised. And I'm cognizant of the fact that I don't know where and when you are in space and time, and I don't know where you might be geographically, right? I have, friends that live internationally, and YouTube and Facebook and these platforms are international. So who knows when you're watching this and where you're located, but there are a lot of people in the United States right now of all political stripes and persuasions that are very surprised, because many, many people predicted that we would not know the result of this election, that it was going to be extremely close, and we might, it might take days or weeks to be able to have it, and it might be contentious, and it might be, disputed. And so Kamala Harris did give her concession speech for President Trump. President Biden has given a speech about a peaceful transition and the desire, to have a peaceful transition. And so here's what I want to say about God's will. All of us, irrespective of our religious experiences and traditions, any kind of ordinations or degrees, whatever the situation, we need to be very, very careful when we invoke a professed knowledge of God's will. The reason I started with Lincoln's second inaugural is that as the President of the United States and as a person of faith, President Lincoln recognized in 1865 that, the Bible had been used for centuries to justify slavery. And we had people of faith, we had people who professed to be Christians and followers of Jesus who claimed that God was on their side. And one of the things that I have now heard people in person say, and I have seen on YouTube and on social media, was how the result of this election was the will of God. And so I want to just jump into this. I don't want to make this a 20-minute video, but let's talk about the claim that a particular political outcome was something that God wanted to have happen. Let's take another historical analogy, okay? I think we would go back, I wanted to say 1936, but I know it's the 1930s, when Adolf Hitler was elected in Germany democratically, right? And he came to power. And the things that happened as a result of that, to include World War II, to include the Holocaust and the genocide of millions of Jewish people, as well as many others, all of that came from an election. And when we look at Germany and pre-war Germany, the rise of Christian nationalism and the confluence or the combination of politics with faith was extremely prevalent. And so just as we had seen in the Civil War in the United States, when both North and South, claimed to be on the side of righteousness and claim God, the same thing was happening in Germany. And here's where I want to just jump into it, okay? And I'm going to share my perspective as a follower of Jesus, as, an ordained elder in the Presbyterian Church. I was an ordained deacon first, and then an ordained elder in the PCUSA denomination, then in the ECO denomination. Now, my wife and I are back in the PCUSA denomination here in Charlotte. So I'm not a pastor, but I have grown up in the church, and I've been in the church my entire life. with some times in college where I didn't attend a lot. And I know that in the Old Testament, those who would profess to be prophets and to speak for God and who spoke falsely were put to death. Okay? It was a very, very bad thing to falsely speak for God. And I am not saying that we should be putting people to death. Unfortunately, there's even been some discussion in the last couple years about, how people should be put to death based upon what they've said. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that it's really important when we profess to speak for God. And just as in the Civil War of the United States, both sides could not be on the side of God. I mean, that's true in the election today. We need to recognize how there are some really, really big feelings in our nation, in the United States of America right now, and in the world, okay, over things that are happening. And we need to be very, very careful when we invoke a professed knowledge of God's will. And let me make another analogy or connection. I am very thankful that I have not lost one of our children. We have 3 grown children now, which are all adults. They're all over 21. And I know people who have lost children. I know people who, when they have lost a loved one, have had someone come to them and say, well, it's God's will. Do you know how much damage is done? Ostensibly for a good purpose, but in the name of sharing God's will, when we profess to know what God's will is, and when something that a person, okay, let's think about the parent who has lost a child, is reeling from that, and then someone comes along and says, well, it's God's will. Folks, we've got to be very, very careful when we invoke the will of God and we talk about the will of God, especially in politics. Because one of the things that I think a lot of folks in the United States don't obviously remember, because who was alive when the 30 Years' War happened in, Europe? None of us were. Okay, all those people are dead now. But when you study history, and it's so important to study history and to understand its lessons, there were really, really good reasons why the founding authors of our founding documents in the United States, our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, which were not perfect documents and are not perfect documents, but they were big moves forward, for governance in the world, and we're still an experiment here in the United States. There were important reasons why they wanted to create a separation of church and state, and they did not want this confluence of religion and faith, because they had seen and knew about the death and destruction and hatred which had caused all kinds of death in Europe and in other parts of the world in the name of God. So my caution to all of us is, let's be very sensitive and let's be cautious when we try and invoke God's will. As a follower of Jesus, here's what I know about Jesus. Jesus came giving us the greatest commandment, which is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. Okay? Jesus did not establish the Roman Empire. We have had a confluence of politics and authority and empire for centuries in the world. And it's really important, I believe, as a follower of Jesus, to read the Bible and to read those words. Like, this is why Martin Luther, nailed those 95 Theses on the door of Wittenberg Castle or whatever in the 1500s that launched the Protestant Reformation, because there were all kinds of things that the church, which became known as the Catholic Church, was doing at the time with indulgences, the selling of indulgences, when you would just pay money to, build St. Peter's Basilica and build these other structures, to, earn and buy, not earn, but buy the forgiveness, for your ancestors, for all this stuff. There were all kinds of extra biblical things. Please, I exhort anybody who is a follower of Jesus and anyone who is interested in what Jesus actually said and professed, read the Gospels of Christ. Read the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is the advocate for the persecuted. He is the advocate for the widow and for the orphan. He is the advocate for the immigrant, for the foreigner. Jesus calls us to love, and not just to love people that look like us, to love in a very transcendental and mystical and powerful way that we can't even understand, because how could we love people that spit on us? How could we love people that hate us? How could we love people that do terrible things? God calls us, to be his agents of love on the earth. So please be very careful as you use the words God's will. Okay, it is possible to discern God's will, and it's a really important thing to do, to discern what God's will is for us individually and what his will is for us collectively as a community, as a state, as a nation, as a world. The last thing I'll leave with you is this. Here is the work. This is the work to which I believe I am called by God today. And it is to build the beloved community. It is to connect with others, to find other people. And this is here at school. This is in our church. This is in our community. This is in our neighborhood. And to connect and to support and to love and to see and to accept and to live with the fruits of the Spirit, okay, that Paul talks about in Ephesians. Okay, love, peace, patience, joy, kindness, gentleness, self-control. Against these things there is no law. Okay? I pray that each of us can be filled with the fruits of the Spirit and can share the love of God, the love of Jesus with others. Hope you have a great day.